The Illuminated Bible Story Book for Young People by Elizabeth Morton. Printed in the U.S.A., copyright 1927, published by the John C. WINSTON Company, Chicago, Philadelphia, Toronto. Includes 20 colored illustrations. Today's reading is Abraham and his son Isaac. After the flood, the earth again became covered with people. Not all of them were good, and as time went on, they seemed to grow more wicked. They worshiped the sun, the moon, and the stars, and other false gods instead of the true God. In one of the great cities, a city with beautiful temples and buildings, there lived a rich and noble family. In this family, there was a son called Abram. Abram hated the idol worship, and he built altars and brought offerings to sacrifice to God. One day, as Abram was tending his flocks, he heard God calling to him. God said, "Gather together your family and your flocks and all your belongings and start out on a long, long journey. Leave this country that you are now living in and come to a land which I shall show you. There I shall make your name great, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Perhaps Abram did not quite understand the promise of God, but because God had told him to do this thing, he obeyed. He was not a bit afraid of what might happen to him in a strange country, for he knew that God was with him. By and by, Abram came into the land of Canaan. Here were beautiful high hills and green valleys and plenty of grass for the sheep and cattle. God told Abram that all the land around him, as far as he could see, would one day belong to his family. Years passed, and still Abram and Sarah, his wife, had no children, and they wondered how the promise that God had made to them could be fulfilled. But one day, when Abram was nearly 100 years old, an angel appeared to him and promised him a son. Abram promised in return to serve God faithfully. It was at this time that God said, "Your name shall no more be Abram, but Abraham." And then sometime after the visit of the angel, a son was born to Abraham and his wife, and they called him Isaac. You can imagine how happy the father and mother of the little baby were. Perhaps they made a great feast and invited all their friends, so they too might rejoice in the birth of this wonderful little boy. Of course, Abraham loved his son very dearly, and as the years passed, this love grew greater and greater. Abraham knew that Isaac was a child of promise, and he kept looking toward the day when Isaac would grow up and have children of his own, and that those who would descend from Isaac would be a great nation. By and by, Isaac grew to be a young man. His father had taught him to worship and serve God, and perhaps put gifts on the altars of sacrifice. No doubt Isaac was a dutiful, happy boy, and we may be sure he loved his father Abraham dearly. When God saw how much Abraham loved his boy, he asked him to do a strange and terrible thing. He wanted to be quite sure that Abraham believed in him and trusted him with his whole heart. And so he took this way of testing him. He said, "Abraham, take your dear son Isaac, whom you love so much, and go into the land of Moriah. There on the top of the hill, build an altar and offer up Isaac to God, as you would sacrifice a lamb or a calf." Of course, poor Abraham did not understand just why God should ask him to give up his beloved son. But because God had commanded, Abraham made haste to obey. He started to get ready, for it was a 3-day journey to the land of Moriah. He and Isaac started out together, taking with them 2 servants and a donkey laden with wood for the fire. For 2 days they traveled, sleeping at night under the trees. At last, on the 3rd day, Abraham saw the mountain where Isaac was to be offered as a sacrifice. As they came near to the foot of the mountain, Abraham told his servants to stay at the foot of the mountain while he and Isaac went up to worship God. Then Abraham took the wood from the back of the donkey and placed it on Isaac's shoulder. He himself took the knife. As they climbed the mountainside together, Isaac began to question his father. He said, "My father, see, here's the wood and the fire, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "My boy, God will provide himself a lamb." We do not know if Isaac quite understood that he was to be the sacrifice, but when they reached the place, Abraham built an altar of stones and earth, and on it he placed the wood. Then he bound the hands and feet of his boy and laid him on the wood. Little Isaac did not scream nor struggle, for he was ready, just as his father was, to obey God. And just as Abraham had the knife ready in his hand to slay his son, a voice called to him and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" And Abraham answered, "Here am I, Lord." Then the angel said, "Do not harm the lad. Now I know that you love God more than you love your son, because you have not withheld your only son from me. I know that you fear God." How overjoyed Abraham must have felt as he heard these words, and how quickly he must have unbound Isaac's hands and feet. And just as he unbound the boy, he looked around, and behold, there in the bushes he saw a ram caught by its horns. So he took that ram and offered it as an offering to God. It is easy for boys and girls to imagine that walk down the mountain, for now Abraham knew that Isaac belonged to God, and God blessed Abraham more and more, and promised him again that in him all the nations of the earth should be blessed. And God blessed Abraham more and more, and promised him again that in him all the nations of the earth should be blessed.